This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, a college football writer with the Associated Press. My guest today is Bud Elliott, National Recruiting Analyst for 24/7 Sports. We're bringing Bud on to do a little NFL draft post-mortem and to talk about rating high school prospects. Most of the first round of the draft consisted of players who were 5- and 4-star prospects coming out of high school. With all the information available on prospects these days, it does seem as if evaluations are getting better, at least at the highest end. Plus, we'll get into a discussion about the University of Miami, which continues to have a lot of players drafted, but not much success on the field to speak of. What's the problem with the U? Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast and Apple Podcast. Just about anywhere you get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me today on the podcast is Bud Elliott, National Recruiting Analyst for 24/7 Sports, relatively new to the gig. So first of all, Bud, thanks for coming on. Secondly, I hope you're enjoying the new gig. And thirdly, in the big picture here, I hope you're doing well. Hope your family's well. Hope everybody's safe and healthy.
Ralph, I appreciate you having me on, and I always enjoy listening to the AP podcast. We're doing well. We're down here in Orlando. My wife and I already worked from home, so not really a change. The only thing is we both. We would travel a lot for work, right? Me going to camps and combines or visiting schools to do stories. And she works in insurance and has to be out of the house a good bit. But now we're just like, what do you do when you're around each other 24/7, right? So that's been a bit of a change.
Well, I want to get into sort of a little post-draft competition, and one of the things that was a story circulating around after the draft is I don't have the exact number in front of me now, but the majority of the first-round draft picks were 4- and 5-star recruits, which that should be the way it is to a certain degree. That shouldn't be surprising. But it also got, I think, me and other folks who aren't necessarily as plugged into recruiting as much as I cover college football. Recruiting is something I sort of dip a toe into and keep an eye on, and then rely on guys like Bud to really fill in the details. So let's start with this. Are you and the folks who do what you do getting better at this whole high school evaluation thing about rating these players? Because it would seem like the hit rate seems to be going up for the elite, at least the elite prospects.
So the answer to that overall is yes. I looked at the average star rating of players in the first round, and this year we did have the highest average star rating ever. That was 3.75, and that's based on players out of high school. It's even better, obviously, when you include junior college kids who have been re-rated after leaving high school and going, to junior college. But 3.75 was a full tenth of a point better than the prior high, which I think was 2 years ago at 3.65. So certainly a good indication there. Also, the first draft ever, as far as I can tell, going back, I think, 12 years, that we only had a single player who was rated 2 stars or unrated out of high school go in the first round, which is pretty surprising. Usually you will have 2 or 3, sometimes 4, just because the number of players who are encompassed in that data set is so large. But yeah, overall, so 5-star and 4-star players, they make up roughly 7% of all your scholarship signees for football on a yearly basis. And yet they were basically 66% of the first round. So 2/3 of your first round came from just 7% of the player pool. That's a pretty good job overall. It's not perfect. I mean, there's some misses that I think we would have liked to have back. And Barton Simmons, our director of recruiting, I talked to him about it. And at the same time, there's some things that if we were to change our process to try to account for or accommodate some of these guys that we quote unquote missed on, it could actually lead to us missing in other areas, right? I mean, the example with your single 2-star or unrated kid was Brandon Ayuk, the Arizona State star who was taken by the 49ers. Well, he didn't have any college offers because he didn't have academics to get into college. Should you, as a recruiting service, throw 4 stars on him, knowing that the chance that player is going to have a successful college career and get drafted is diminished because of academics? Like it is riskier to have to go. I mean, Ralph, you covered Mississippi for a while, right? I mean, you know the JUCO route is no guarantee that you will make it back. So those are some of the challenges that we face. But overall, it was a very strong draft for the industry.
Is it as simple as more information, more availability? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons why, again, like the industry, as you put it, is doing is sort of getting things right. And again, I almost hate to call it right because there's a lot of noise in these rankings, right? There's a lot of development that goes on between the time a kid is a junior in high school and is a junior in college or a senior in college. Especially football is a sport where size matters a lot. So there's simply growing that could be done and things along those lines, and maturity. That said, if you were sort of to try to piece out or pull out a couple of threads that are making it easier, not easier, but making the ranking system more efficient and better, what would they be?
So I think there's been several real leaps forward in the evaluation process, probably over the last decade, right? The increase in camps which allow you to see elite players go against elite players. I mean, there are areas of the country where if you have a really elite player in that area, he may never play against another kid who is, a Power 5 kid. And so you're watching him just crush these guys on film, and you're like, all right, he looks amazing, but it's just hard to figure out how good he is because the guys he's playing against are just not going to be getting a scholarship to play college football at the next level. I think the wide availability of digital film, particularly like over the last 6 or 7 years, has really helped the industry as a whole. You talk to some of these guys who were doing rankings, back in the early 2000s. Like, yeah, there was YouTube by mid 2000s, right? Like probably 06, 07. But still the process there for the most part was go around to all these high schools, gather up the film, and FedEx the tapes back to your home office, whether that was Nashville or Seattle or whatever company you were with. And now everybody can pull up the film. I mean, we have a rankings call every Wednesday that is blocked off for 90 minutes and usually goes about 2.5 hours, right? And we'll go through there and everybody kind of proposes, hey, this guy, and this guy I think should be considered for 4-star status. We currently have him as a 3, and I think his grade should be this, and this. And everybody having the ability on a conference call to screen share and put out the kid's film because it's available digitally is a really big advancement. Otherwise, you're dealing with VHS tapes, and that's a lot different than it used to be. And then I think the third element here would be just more awareness generally of which positions can you rely on their high school stats a little bit more. And the one that I have in mind would be quarterback. I think it is easier to project quarterbacks now than it used to be based on their data in high school. Nowadays, I don't think we're going to take a kid who's a 55% high school passer and make him a high 4-star or a 5-star just based on his physical tools, unless we have a real good reason to think, okay, everybody around him was pretty terrible on this team, and we know that maybe that high school coach is not very good, et cetera. But because the schemes that the high schools are running now are closer to what they're running in college, and closer to what they're running in the NFL, there's a little more kind of agreement of all the spread stuff now. It is a little bit easier. And like pitching and catching is really important. You have to be an accurate thrower because a lot of these college coaches, despite what they think, don't end up fixing your accuracy. And we find that like high school accuracy is more predictive now probably than ever.
It's interesting. I think back to, boy, it makes me feel old to think that like Brett Favre is an old timer. But I think back to, Brett Favre, when one of the reasons why he ended up at Southern Miss, and you'll hear lots of stories about guys like this from that era. Well, he only threw like 6 passes a game in high school. They were running, an offense where they basically ran the ball all the time, or a guy was an option quarterback. But those things, as you said, I mean, a little bit of a place where I have stepped into recruiting the last couple of years is doing a story sort of based on how things are different. Like high school football is run differently in different parts of the country and what that means for college football. But so the little bit that I was on high school campuses last year bouncing around, I mean, everybody's running some type of spread, some type of, ball in the air offense a lot more than they used to. So, yeah, it said that those days where you'd find that gem quarterback who's only throwing the ball 5 or 6 times a game or 10 times a game, I'm sure that still exists to a certain degree, but it's probably just a lot more rare.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, you don't have to go back that far. I mean, 15 years or with Favre. I mean, gosh, Favre was probably 20 years ago. He was in high school, or 25. I'm trying to think
about
now.
That, right?
I mean, late 80s Southern Miss or early 90s. You don't have to go back that far, even, right? Like there were a lot of good football teams in Texas or Florida or Georgia or California that still ran like wing T in the mid 2000s. And that's just kind of a nightmare to evaluate a quarterback based off. Now, if you're a really good type quarterback, your coach is either going to run the spread or you are probably going to transfer to a high school that will allow you to show your arm off and really throw. There's not that many guys out there anymore who we have to guess at how they'll do with a lot of reps. There's some, but not that many.
So I didn't necessarily expect to stay on this subject, but I just wrote a thing about quarterbacks, so it's always an interesting subject matter to me. Do you think it is getting that the trickier part of quarterback evaluation now is a preponderance of kids who have some pretty refined skills? Because so many of these kids are getting into the pipeline in grade school, they're getting personal coaching. So I'm wondering how that affects the evaluation process when you have so many kids who are advanced, not necessarily for the time, but advanced compared to maybe what their predecessors were.
I don't think there's any doubt that that's a challenge, right? Because you have to kind of take into account and think, okay, is this this guy kid? Is this that guy kid? And that guy meaning like private quarterback coach, right? And what do they teach? Why does he do this? What like, does he have a hitch in his motion to, there's a lot of stuff out there. Sorry, that answer is kind of rambling, but you do have to kind of take into account how developed is this kid? How much more could he still develop? So the accuracy stuff I was talking about, right? And the production at the high school level, yes, we do value it more than we ever have. But it's also sort of a like necessary but not sufficient condition to success. I kind of think, to go all SAT on you, I guess. But like you have to still project future growth, right? Jake Fromm ended up being what did he go, 5th round, 6th round?
5th, yeah.
So physically he ended up not, I don't think like his arm got that much stronger at Georgia, right? Like he had a great career at Georgia, but did he actually get physically better at Georgia, or was he kind of maxed out when we saw him? Something I spoke with Barton about on our Barton and Bud show, the new podcast we're doing for 24/7, is if you talk to baseball scouts, they all refer to kids by their age. And there's generally kind of like a standardized date in baseball, and I forget what it is, but they're like, okay, this kid will be such and such age as of whatever, like August 1st, and so his baseball age is this. That's something that I know we do internally at 24/7, and I think something that maybe could be worth looking into as well. You get a guy like a Daniel Jones, who was drafted in the 1st round by the Giants. And he was, I think, either a 0-star or a 2-star coming out of a small private high school in Charlotte. But he was also like 18 months younger than his grade level. So he continued to develop and get a lot better at Duke. And I wonder if we as an industry can pay even more attention to sort of like the inefficiencies of age. Not that you would downgrade older kids, but you might not project as much continued development from the older kids while looking for reasons why maybe some other kid might be able to develop a little bit more.
That's an interesting point. I know baseball is very sensitive to that. Baseball scouting is very, very sensitive. And I don't know sort of at the pro scouting and within the college, let's say within a college staff, I know that they're certainly paying attention to the idea that, hey, man, this kid isn't even 18 yet and he's at this level. There's some more projectability there. But I don't know if football has embraced it and really bake that into the bread as much as baseball has. That's a fascinating point. So before we wrap up on this particular topic, let me try to, if you can, it might be a little bit of a stretch here to get just to sort of like give me some examples of maybe a player or a prospect who you once saw who, again, maybe it was the grainy footage days or something along those lines, or where you didn't have as much information, where boy, like the athleticism looks good, but maybe we haven't had a chance to see him against the right competition because he hasn't been at camps. Is it even possible for you to give me an example of that type of player who ended up being a 4 or 5 star that didn't really pan out? And then when you looked at it in retrospect, you sort of were like, well, maybe here's where we saw it coming. Here are the things that we should have seen coming, and now we can look for them in the future.
Sure. So you're basically looking at reasons why kids bust. I almost thought you were going to ask me, like, is there, are there examples of kids who you look back on, you said, hey, we should have made him a 4-star because we missed, X.
Well, I'll be happy to get both of those, but let's start with what, kids who have busted, and that again, you sort of look back and you go, here was the red flag that we had missed because maybe we were lacking some information. And
sure,
not necessarily the off the field stuff, because I understand a lot of it is tied to like, hey, grades, and maybe there's a lack of dedication there.
Right. Yeah. That is a really important one. I would say, if you look at the quarterback position, I think just go back 10 years with the quarterback position. How many times did we, as an industry, fall in love with guys who had great tools but didn't necessarily have awesome production in high school? And like it. I think it's important that we watch, like, not only how hard they're throwing the ball, right, and how good they look in shorts and t-shirt, but like, are they actually hitting their targets? Like what everybody looks good on a highlight film, but if you dig into their data a little more, and also talk to people, like, yeah, guy didn't really see the game well. I mean, not to just focus on quarterback position, but like go down, pull up the top 10 rankings in the quarterback position for the class of 2010, and it's pretty much just straight bust, right?
Yep.
Phillip Sims, the kid who signed with Bama, Blake Bell, Devin Gardner, Jesse Scroggins, Rob Bolden, Tyler Bray, Jake Heaps, who wasn't terrible, Connor Wood, Paul Jones, Barry Brunetti. I'm down here to 11 and 12. Brett Nottingham, AJ Derby, James Franklin ended up playing for Missouri. He was actually not bad.
Right, but there are no NFL players. It's funny, I was doing some of this research, and again, that's what got me into this idea of, like, it seems like we're getting better at this, because I did notice as recently as 2010, it was just nothing but misses, or at least guys who, never got good enough to play in the NFL, and you would think there's at least going to be a handful of those guys who are 5 stars who are going to end up in the NFL.
Exactly. And there's so much more that goes into playing the quarterback position than just, arm talent and looking pretty. I mean, like, you have to have other elements. And, there are guys, I think more recently, who I'm not trying to, to bag on, but like, people were kind of told, hey, this is really not a great kid. Like he's sort of kind of a jerk and maybe not the most mature guy. And we don't know how well it's going to work out at the quarterback position. But like, I think if you went back to the class of 2010 now, I don't think a lot of those guys would have ended up 4 and 5 stars. I don't think so. On the other side of things, like, there's a whole list of factors that I actually keep, and I've kept for like a decade, right? Here, let me see if I can pull this up for you. Serious academic issues. Maybe football was not their primary sport. From a foreign country, if they're a full year younger than their class. Growth spurt, which is not something we can really control. If you gain more than 15% of your body weight after reaching college and you keep your quickness, there's a really good chance we're going to miss on you. And just for an example, like, that's basically from going from like 190 to 225. That's a whole different player. Usually that also corresponds with a significant position change, which is also something that we we have on here. If the player was really injured in high school, that's another one that he might have limited film because we just didn't see him as much because he was constantly hurt. Khalil Mack is a pretty good example of that, although we should have seen him better in his senior year. But as a junior, he was hurt. Darnell Savage, the Maryland kid, also kind of fit into that in the 2019 draft. Multiple transfers in high school is another thing that can trip us up, right? Because we have regional guys, and like Josh Allen, the defensive end who Jacksonville took out of Kentucky, if you recall.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
He played as a freshman in Jersey, then moved to Alabama and played basketball, right, in a town of only 3,000 people, so not a really ton of exposure there. Then played receiver, I'm trying to remember this, as a junior in Alabama, then transferred back up to New Jersey and switched positions and played defensive end. So all of a sudden, if you're the regional analyst in New Jersey, you got a guy at a new school at a new position who you're not really going to be that aware of all that soon. And it's hard to track these kids when they transfer schools. Some of these kids in South Florida will be at 4 different schools in 4 years because now the state of Florida has open transfers. You don't have to sit out if you transfer. So that's an issue that we try to combat best we can, right? If you're the Florida analyst and a kid's moved up to Jersey, you shoot a text to our Jersey analyst. But that's not easy to do. And I mean, Josh Allen went extremely under-recruited simply because not a lot of people saw him because he was new, right? Like nobody knew to be looking for him there. Kentucky got him because a high school coach in Jersey, not even Allen's high school coach, but an opposing high school coach told his brother or cousin who was on University of Kentucky's staff, hey, this kid playing defensive end, I never heard of him, but he really tore us up in our game last night. And that's how UK got on the guy.
I'm talking with Bud Elliott. He is the national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports. We're going to take a quick break. I want to get into another couple of topics, one having to do with the University of Miami. Bud lives in Florida, so I know he used to be on Noel's Cast.
Yeah, so I started Tomahawk Nation, but I still have Noel Cast. Just it's way too big to give up, and a lot of people kind of like the national perspective on a team program, and we have some local guys who help us out.
We're going to take a quick break here. We're talking with national recruiting analyst from 24/7 Sports, Bud Elliott. We're going to get into a couple of different topics. I want to get into a discussion about Miami because their recruiting and NFL production is not really matching the production on the field. So I want to tap into Bud a little bit on that subject, and I want to talk to him a little bit about we are in a very extended dead period for recruiting, and I want to figure out how that will impact this year's class, next year's class, and is impacting schools all around the country right now. So take a quick break on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast and be back right after this with Bud Elliott.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast, talking with Bud Elliott, 24/7 Sports, national recruiting analyst. So, it's funny, obviously, we love to talk about the U and when the U's coming back, and so much talk about Miami and why they are sort of stuck in a rut. And I find it to be somewhat fascinating, especially because I am of the age where I remember the Miami dynasty. So the idea of Miami coming back is alluring to me. I'm not a Miami fan, but it sort of is. It's the college football I remember. So there's always a lot of talk about what's going on with Miami. So I sort of did a little research myself, and, guys getting drafted is not the be-all, end-all in what your program is going to be, but it's a usually pretty good indication of where you are as a program. And since 2011, Miami's had 52 players drafted. Since 2011, Clemson has had 54 players drafted. Now, the biggest difference there is Clemson has had 27 players drafted in the first 3 rounds, including 12 first-round draft picks, where Miami has only had 16 players drafted in the first 3 rounds, including 4 first-round draft picks. Most of Miami's draft picks have been in the last 3 rounds, 25 overall, including 12 sixth-rounders and 6 seventh-rounders. And again, Miami's recruiting rankings generally have been pretty good, though they've had some peaks and valleys. They've had a number 1 class in 2008 and a 33rd ranked class a couple years later, and that has to do, I'm sure, a lot with coaching changes because Miami has been volatile as far as that end. Plus, they got dragged down for a couple of years with some NCAA issues. That is a very long lead up, Bud Elliott, for me to ask you, what the hell's going on with Miami? Why do they seem to be getting pretty good players, but they can't win the ACC Coastal, which is a division that is sort of there for them to take? They're outperforming everybody else in that division as far as talent accumulation, or so it seems.
So I think you're exactly right. They are underperforming some. And I'm interested to see how Manny Diaz will do down there. The first thing that I think of when I think of why is Miami underperformed, it's quarterback, right? They've had some guys who have been physically talented, but not guys who have been developed, not guys who make good decisions with the ball. And honestly, I think they've had a real vacuum of quarterback leadership down there. Like the stories you would hear about some of the quarterbacks in that room the last couple of years were, it was like stuff you would put up with from a really good defensive tackle, right? Because he's not the face of your program, and if he's really good, you'll kind of let some behavior slide. But quarterbacks, for the most part, need to be your leaders. That's kind of a cliche, but I think there's some truth to that. And if the quarterback acts a certain way, then that's sort of a cue to everybody else in the huddle that they can also act that way and not act like a good teammate and not really take everything seriously. So I think that's certainly been a huge issue for them, and we'll see if Derek King is able to help them out. I think he'd be able to help them out more if he was actually on campus with everybody else, but during the shutdown, that's not possible. I think the second thing would be like coaching and coaching continuity on offense. I mean, they've been through so many different offensive coordinator changes there. What are they trying to do? And I think if they just stuck with the same guy for a couple of years and maybe Rhett Lashley, their new offensive coordinator, will be the right answer, I think that could really help them. But quarterback development and overall offensive coaching have been really big issues down there. Because defensively, Miami has rated really high, both in traditional metrics, but also in a lot of the advanced metrics, like our friend Bill Connolly's. And I don't think there's really anything all that wrong with what Miami is doing defensively. To me, it's solely an issue on the offense for the most part. And we actually know through the data that recruiting rankings are not as predictive on the offensive side of the ball as they are on the defensive side of the ball. And my opinion on that has always been, I think that offense is more of a team game, whereas defense is more of like a collective individual effort. Mm-hmm. It's very much like do your job, but on offense, a lot of times it's like everybody has to work really together. It's not just 11 guys doing their individual job. There is some concert and some synergy required on offense that I don't think is there on defense. So the recruiting rankings, which have a large basis in size, speed combination, right, and projection, tend to project defense better than they do offense, which also implies that coaching is more important on the offensive side of the ball. Miami having kind of iffy offensive coaching in recent years, combined with some quarterback issues, has, I think, sort of exacerbated the problem and really highlighted it. I also think, and I'm hesitant to wade in these waters a little bit, but I do believe that like the fan base down there, because it is, there are certainly some diehards who are just diehard Miami Hurricane fans who would show up regardless of circumstance. But that's a bit of a front-running town. Look at the Heat games when they're good and when they're not. The Marlins in the World Series generally sold tickets and they treated their fans like crap, obviously. So, they don't really sell tickets anymore. But there's a certain element, I think, to where when you're a small private school and you don't have that big of an alumni base and it's a bit of a front-running fan base, I think they're more susceptible to losing these games against sort of like the mid-tier ACC teams than you would think they should be. And just because I don't think that their home field advantage is great when Florida State is not playing, or when Notre Dame's not coming to town, or Clemson. They don't. I don't think that they had that energy to get up to play some of those games that their recruiting rankings say they're better than. And I think their mentality, and it probably starts with all the people around them saying, you guys should walk all over Duke, right? Well, Duke's not that bad under David Cutcliffe. Like, that's a game you need to take seriously. It's a divisional game. You should take it seriously. But I don't know what they do all the time. And they've had a number of just really head-scratching losses to ACC teams that they certainly have more talent than. And I do wonder if there's a mentality aspect, which also might tie into the quarterback leadership thing that they have not had.
So let me throw something out here on this topic. Last year, I remember talking to Manny Diaz about this, and what he said, and I don't know if this is excuse making or there's usually there is a balance between there's like some elements of truth in this, but how much it factors into this problem that Miami has had sort of launching maybe is it, how do you weigh how much this factors in? So what he had mentioned is, a lot of times in South Florida where we are doing the bulk of our recruiting, the high school programs might not be quite as developed as they are in places like Georgia or Texas. So we are getting a caliber of prospect who has a great ceiling, incredible athlete, but might need a little more polish, might need a little more weight room, might need a little more adjustment to the diet. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. If you think that there is some element of truth to that, and let me let you answer that part of it, and then I'll come back with another part of it that is related to guys leaving early. So, what do you think about the idea that the Miami's natural recruiting base is a base of players that might need a little more polish than maybe some of the more well-equipped high school programs in, let's say, Georgia, Texas, and other parts of Florida?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, and we see that. Like, there's some coaching in South Florida and just throughout the state that's really poor. And like, you talk to coaches down here, they know that the state of Georgia pays coaches more, sometimes a lot more, right? There's some coaches in Georgia that make six figures to coach high school football. And in Florida, you just don't really seem to have that. And Texas largely the same way. So I would totally agree with Manny Diaz that they are getting players who are more raw. Now, I think the ceiling of these players is as high or higher than probably any other state out there. But a lot of the coaching in Florida is not really good. Like I would almost blindly bet, I mean, not that I'm wagering high school football, but like just I would blindly pick some of these teams that I know in South Florida because I know even if they don't have the best talent that year, they're going to win because like I know that guy can actually coach and run a program and develop some of his talent. Some of these guys literally just cannot.
So the other part of that is Miami I feel like leads the world in juniors who get drafted in the 6th round. Now that's sounds a little harsh, but they continually have players who leave early, get drafted, but sort of end up being 2nd or 3rd day draft picks, which again sort of leads me to this whole idea of development. Are they not doing a good job developing these kids? Is it the lack of continuity they've had on their staff over the years where kids are sort of bailing early? Is there any sort of common thread here to why it seems like Miami is always getting these kids who are leaving early? Maybe, and again, every kid has a different story as to why, so sometimes it's hard to come up with a common denominator there. But this idea of like kids are leaving early, so Miami doesn't seem to ever have that situation where, man, we had like 6 or 7 kids come back or 4 or 5 kids come back who we weren't expecting to, and that is going to propel us to this big season this year. Because I was even looking at it this year. I mean, if a few of these kids who left early, the DJ Dallases of the world, had come back, you almost look at Miami and think, boy, this could be a pretty good bounce back year for them.
That's one of the downsides of selling that pro mentality and selling that pro track record, right, as your main selling point. Pro canes, right, as they call it, and I don't think it's a bad selling point at all. In fact, I think it's pretty smart, but that it is a downside in that it might foster like a little bit less collegial feel. You know what I mean? Like I don't know how to explain this, but there's some of these SEC programs or some of these Big Ten programs, it just feels like their players are still kind of kids at times. You know what I mean? And then you go to some of these programs where it just feels like football factory. And Ralph, you visited them. You know what I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. But Clemson does put out NFL guys, but they still feel kind of collegial. And I don't know that some of these programs, maybe like Miami, had that same feel. It's they might be suffering from I got to get to the pros, got to get to the pros. It's me type thing. But also there's probably some inherent reasons why Clemson's like that. And if they weren't winning, I don't know that Clemson would be like that. So maybe it's a chicken or egg question.
Yeah, it is hard to figure out which does come first there. But it does seem, again, I think there's no doubt that Miami is underperforming. And I do just wonder if now the most important thing Miami can do is to give Manny Diaz and Rhett Lashley, now his next offensive coordinator, some time. I almost think that the most important thing Miami could use now is a little breathing room and continuity, again, to get some kind of consistent culture built up in that program. Of course, the problem is today in college football, if you have a 2-2 start, everybody wants to boot you. That has a ripple effect into your recruiting. It gets negative, and all of a sudden you've fired a coach after 2 years. It's not a healthy situation to be in, and we'll see how Miami tracks out the rest of the way. So the last thing I wanted to touch on with you, Bud, is we are now into the most extended dead period in the history of spring college recruiting. How is the lack of official visits, because you can do those now at this time of the year, camps, all the things that are being taken away from the recruiting cycle because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, how is this affecting recruiting for the upcoming class and maybe future classes? Maybe it might even be more for the 2022 class than the 2021 class.
Well, it's made evaluations tougher for all programs. I talk to coaches and personnel guys, and they're like, man, we're just, we're going back over existing film. We're having different coaches watch the film. We're trying to figure out, maybe, is this a kid that we held off on offering, but only did so because we wanted them to come to our camp over the summer and use that time for an unofficial visit, basically at our summer camp on our campus, but otherwise he would have probably had an offer. If so, let's go ahead and throw out an offer, because summer camps, for the most part, are not happening. I mean, I can't say every school out there is going to cancel, but my strong suspicion is that we don't have traditional style summer camps here, and many states have already said that. So they're having to do that. I think it hurts some kids as far as their ability to be discovered, because there's some kids who just, in this current class, who maybe didn't have great junior years. Maybe they're just now physically maturing or coming into their own, or maybe they were hurt as a junior and would have been able to impress us at a summer camp. And now, the entire camp season's gone. And so I think colleges and us as the recruiting industry, we have an issue this year of we are having to try, and I almost use the word guess, but we are trying to figure out just how good this kid is and try to figure out how good his competition is, because it's almost all film-based. We're not getting to see these kids in person much this year. Now, if we get the fall football season, that'll certainly be a big-time help. If we don't, I mean, your last data point, if you're a college or if you're us, for the most part, is the 2019 fall season, and that's hard to project off.
How much is already in the bag for the 2021? In other words, if you're, and a lot of times this also depends on how big a program you are. So let's say you're among the, elite or semi-elite, those top, the Power 5 programs, but even the first tier of the Power 5. A lot of times you've already got a pretty good idea of who you're offering officially. You've got a fair amount of commits, and you've got your backup plans in place. So if you're a top-tiered school going into this next cycle, are you in pretty good shape, or do you still need to do some nitty-gritty evaluating?
I think they all still need to do some nitty-gritty evaluation, but some schools really are out ahead. I mean, Ohio State has 17 commits. I actually, spoiler alert here, I have an article coming out showing where Ohio State would rank in the previous 10 years recruiting classes if it simply stopped today. Right, it's all right, April 29th, we're done. No more recruiting for the Buckeyes this year. Where would this class rank? And it's actually going to be really high. I mean, they've got 17 commits, 3 5-stars, 12 4-stars already. North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, Clemson are already off to really high starts, really hot starts. And but yet there's some schools that you just sort of know that they're going to finish pretty highly based on a track record. But LSU only has 6 commits. Right? I mean, A&M has 4 commits. Auburn has 4. Oklahoma has 4. Alabama has 3. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And I do think if you're a program that got all your evaluations done and really dug into this class well in advance, you are being rewarded right now. It's also really detrimental, I think, and I wrote an article about this on 24/7 Sports about how I think due to the coronavirus, we should consider this to be year zero for all new head coaches. Because none of their staff is getting a chance to get on the road and meet with these high school coaches at all. Right? And they're not able to impart their sort of new coach smell and really kind of make an impact with their team in person. I mean, this is going to be just a really weird year for all these new staffs out there.
I couldn't agree more. I think what's going on, the challenges of being a new coach. I talked to Lane Kiffin about this, and he was pretty honest. He's like, yeah, it's definitely a disadvantage for us in a myriad ways, and especially and recruiting is certainly one of those ways. Hey, Bud, thank you very much for doing this. Bud Elliott is the national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports. It is a relatively new gig, one he is most deserving of. Great stuff, Bud. Good luck with everything. Stay safe and healthy down there in Florida, and hopefully when things get back to normal, we will cross paths with each other, possibly even in person.
Looking forward to it, Ralph, and stay safe up there.
And now 3 and out, first down. Before we started recording today's podcast, the NCAA took another step toward allowing athletes to earn money off their names, images, and likenesses by getting Board of Governors approval of a plan. The next phase is writing of legislation, and there are plenty of details still to be hammered out. The NCAA wants guardrails in place to keep this newfound revenue stream to athletes from turning into a recruiting tool or a way to get impermissible benefits to athletes from boosters. But one person's guardrails can look like a cap on compensation to another. There are ways to assess whether an athlete is striking a deal that is fair market value, but the more the NCAA tries to regulate, the more it could get into trouble with lawmakers and maybe lawyers who are pushing for unfettered access to the free market, who maybe think that their NCAA could be violating some antitrust laws. It's a place where the NCAA has gotten in trouble before. I think regulation is doable. Parameters on this compensation are even set for professional athletes. But there will be some needle threading here and scrutiny to how the NCAA structures its rules around these deals. Second down, one last word on the NIL news. This is a pretty big deal. There are millions of NCAA critics, and they will be quick to snipe at what this isn't and focus on all the other inherent issues with college sports. But I have to say I'm pretty surprised the NCAA went this far. Of course, the NCAA's hand was forced, but I think it landed in a pretty good place when it comes to allowing athletes access to a free market. Third down. So I'm not the biggest hot take artist, but this one might be a little warm. Something went wrong at Georgia with Jake Fromm and Justin Fields. I understand that Fromm played very well as a junior, and I was not watching practice to see how Fields was developing that 1 year he spent at Georgia. But I also don't believe you can just say, oh, well, Kirby Smart and crew had no choice and Fields just didn't want to compete. If you have a talent like Fields and a player like Fromm, who is clearly the lesser talent, you can't let Fields get away. If Fields isn't as comfortable in the offense, you have to make him more comfortable. You have to do the things he does well. Fromm is a really good player. I think he has a chance to have a nice pro career because his makeup and intangibles are off the charts. I could absolutely see him developing into some combination of second-tier starter and long-time solid backup. But Georgia could have had a mega talent at quarterback in Fields for 2 or 3 years and let him get away. There is no way you can tell me that isn't some type of failure by Kirby Smart and his staff. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.